I'm Siobhan McGee and I'm the chair of the Irish Consortium on Gender-Based Violence and also CEO of ActionAid Ireland. We'd like to warmly welcome everyone to the event. We're exploring GBV, gender-based violence, as a hindrance and consequence to participation in society, understanding the barriers for women and girls with disabilities. Just at the outset, I wanted to alert you to the fact that there are captions available for the event. The link is in the Zoom chat or in the YouTube description for those joining by live stream. And for any reason you need the captions and cannot find them, email info@gbv.ie. We're really pleased to have this event today in conjunction with the Department of Foreign Affairs and with CBM as part of the ongoing Commission of Status on Women this week, and which this year is focusing on the full and equitable and equal participation of women in society. In 2020, CBM and the Consortium on Gender-Based Violence launched a very important paper called Disability Inclusion in GBV Programming, which can be shared with everyone here. It was on the need for disability inclusion in GBV programming, and this conversation today and hearing from our colleagues and friends is an important element of bringing that whole topic forward in our understanding. And we are really aware that women and girls with disabilities face many challenges in having full and equal participation in society, and that GBV, gender-based violence, is one of the ways in which this manifests. So we are really delighted and honoured that we have amazing speakers joining us today, and we'll look forward to hearing your insights on this important topic. Most notably, I first of all want to welcome Ambassador Geraldine Byrne Nason. She's the Irish Ambassador to the United Nations in New York, posted in New York since 2017, and with her team led the way on the campaign for Ireland to become a member of the UN Security Council, and now is leading the way around all of that engagement. So we appreciate that work, and that Ireland, at this time when conflicts are growing ever more complex and protracted, Ireland's place at the table at the Security Council, and especially around ensuring issues around gender-based violence and disability stay on the agenda, which is so important. So in a few moments, we'll be handing over to Mary Keogh to moderate the session and our amazing panel today. But first, I want to warmly welcome Fáilte to Ambassador Byrne Nason, who's going to provide us with some opening remarks. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Siobhan. Dear Eve, good morning to everyone from New York. I'm really delighted to welcome you today to the side event looking at gender-based violence, with a particular focus, as Siobhan said, on the perspective of women and girls with disabilities. For the past number of years, it's been my really sincere, genuine pleasure to participate in the annual CSW event hosted by the Irish Consortium on Gender-Based Violence. Each year, I'm most impressed, and I have to say I'm really enriched by the meeting, and particularly the focus on hearing from grassroots. I think that that's in many ways, the real magic of the CSW. It brings together grassroots with policymakers. So in an Irish sense, a real gathering in many ways. The theme, Siobhan mentioned it at the top of this year's Commission on the Status of Women, is the women's full and effective participation and decision-making in public life, as well as the elimination of violence for achieving gender equality. It couldn't be more timely. As UN Secretary General Guterres has said, COVID is a crisis with a woman's face. The shadow of this pandemic on the pandemic of gender-based violence is just one aspect of that. And yet we see that women continue to be grossly underrepresented in decision-making on COVID. You just have to flip the coin and you see that countries led by women have performed particularly well in their COVID responses. I think that we need to join the dots between those things. And I'm pleased that this year's CSW seeks to do in many ways just that. We're delighted to be joined today by three really inspiring speakers who have tirelessly advocated for the inclusion of women and girls with disabilities in all aspects of life. They've worked on access to justice for women and girls with disabilities, including victims of sexual violence, as well as being advocates for policy reform and inclusion of persons with disabilities across a whole range of areas, from electoral processes to ensuring increased access to information, participation and decision-making, sexual reproductive health rights, and psychosocial support. We have an excellent and engaging discussion ahead of us, so I'll just say a few words to you before we get there. Friends, Ireland places gender equality at the heart of our foreign and development policies. The SDG principle of leaving no one behind is central to our work. Preventing and responding to gender-based violence is part of that, including embedded in our National Action Plan on Women, Peace and Security. We know that ending gender-based violence is a whole of society effort. We really must tackle the underlying root causes, such as unequal power relations and negative and pervasive gendered social norms, stereotypes, and practices which perpetuate and often condone gender-based violence. We really must acknowledge that the vast majority of violence against women is perpetrated by men. We need to say it as it is. Men and boys must be fully engaged in this shared effort to change the harmful and restrictive masculinities that perpetuate violence. Gender equality is central to Ireland's commitment to focus on the furthest behind first. At the core of this is recognizing that women and girls, people living with disabilities, religious and ethnic minorities, and members of the LGBTI+ community, among others, often experience systemic levels of discrimination and exclusion. The increase in gender-based violence and domestic violence during the COVID-19 pandemic has been a universal phenomenon, sparing no country, no woman, no group in the world. It reminds us just how fragile many of the gains we have made in relation to gender equality really are. The reality is that even before the pandemic, 1 in 3 women would experience violence during their lifetime. Women and girls with disabilities are at an even greater risk of GBV, with some studies showing that women with disabilities are twice as likely to experience GBV as non-disabled women, and they are 4 times as likely to experience controlling behavior by partners. Home should be a safe place for all, but many women, girls, non-binary, trans and gender non-conforming persons with disabilities, for them, their homes are a place of fear. In the context of COVID-19 and the related restrictions, these individuals are even less able to escape violence, particularly if their usual supports are not available to them. At the same time, people with disabilities are often excluded from the programs and services that are designed to actually work to prevent and respond to GBV. People with disabilities are often the most marginalized. They face a range of barriers, including physical, attitudinal, communication, institutional, as well as policy and legal barriers. This results in multiple degrees of discrimination, exclusion, and risk. As members of the Irish Consortium on Gender-Based Violence, we were delighted to partner with CBM and others to produce a learning brief on disability inclusive gender-based violence programming, which was launched last year and which Siobhan referred to in our introduction. The learning brief highlights the importance of ensuring a rights-based approach to GBV programming, putting the experiences, the voices and lives of people with disabilities at the center and participating in decision-making and leadership. It also emphasises the need for a rights-based model of disability, focused on breaking down barriers for people with disabilities and strengthening their rights in society. We hope that the brief will be a useful resource to make sure that our work on GBV fully integrates the normative and legal frameworks on the rights of persons with disabilities, such as the International Convention. Turning to Ireland's broader work here at the UN, I'm very proud of the work that Ireland has done as co-chair of a very significant UN group of Friends of Vision in New York. Ireland is leading a group of countries from around the world seeking to improve recognition of the fact that 90% of all vision loss is in low and middle income countries, often due to poor access to health services. So a simple fix. This has seriously a disproportionate impact on women and girls. Women are 8% more likely than men to be blind due to unaddressed vision impairments. So we plan to continue that work actively here at the UN and hopefully to have a resolution in the year ahead. Before I conclude, if you will indulge me for a moment, I want to say a word about the Ireland's place on the Security Council. We took up a seat at that iconic table in January of this year, and we will have the honour, the privilege of sitting there for 2 years. We're very determined to use those 2 years to bring Ireland's emphasis on the furthest behind into the Council. We are exercising leadership on women, peace and security at the Council, including through Ireland having the honour to co-chair the informal expert group on women, peace and security. Disability is part of that approach too. We very much look forward to working with colleagues on the call today with all of you to raising awareness of Security Council Resolution 2475, a groundbreaking resolution agreed in 2019 on the protection of persons with disabilities in conflict. So friends, I hope that you will enjoy the discussion today and that you take real advantage of this opportunity to be uplifted and motivated by our speakers who are really leading the way in raising up voices of women and girls with disabilities. And once again, I'm really deeply honoured to have had the opportunity to speak with you all this morning. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. Thanks for those insightful and wide-ranging remarks talking about the intersectionality of inequality in particular. And today our focus is on that around disability, and also the governance context and the global commitments that we're aspiring to meet together, and the centrality of the rights-based approach. So we're really pleased that you took the time to join us and appreciate that very much. So thank you for that. Now I'm going to hand over to our moderator for the rest of the session, which is Mary Keogh, PhD. Mary, thank you for taking up this role with us today and for adding your kind of experience and insights to this occasion. Mary is Advocacy Director with CBM Global, and she's formerly been Senior Advisor on Disability and Gender Equality and many other long-standing work in this area. So very informed, and we're very grateful to you, Mary, for helping us and engaging with us today. So we're in your hands from here. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Siobhan. I'm really pleased to be here. And Ambassador, thank you so much for your opening remarks. So for the next and for the rest of this session, we're going to be speaking with our panelists, who I'm going to introduce in a moment. But I just wanted to first of all just go through some very quick housekeeping rules. So questions can be posed in the chat. We have a number of questions prepared, but we're also equally really want some audience participation. So please post your questions in the chat. If you're not speaking, can you please keep your camera off? Our panelists with cameras on. This just makes it easier and more inclusive and accessible for accessing sign interpretation. You can pin sign interpretation up. So I think Brianna, thank you, has put some instructions on that in the chat, so how to do that. And there also is captioning, and the the link to that is there also. So we will periodically put that through the webinar so that we can make sure everybody's able to participate. So I'm going to, I mean, we have a really great panel to discuss today, and I'm really pleased to be able to moderate this and also be with this really strong group of women with disabilities. So I'm going to introduce, first of all, the speakers. They're going to speak for 5 minutes each, and then I will be preparing some questions to ask, and then we will be integrating some questions from the chat. So yes, let's start and get going. So in terms of our first speaker, I'm going to turn to Carolyn. Carolyn Dagani is the current president of the Philippine Federation of the Deaf and is in her second term in this role. She's one of the primary movers of the Filipino Sign Language, deaf rights, and other deaf-related movements in the Philippines. I've had the pleasure of meeting Carolyn face-to-face in Manila a number of years ago, so I'm delighted to see you again, Carolyn. She's a really strong advocate around women's rights and gender equality, and she has a lot of experience she can share to us. So Carolyn, I'm going to hand over to you for the next 5 minutes, maybe to take us through some of your key highlights, and looking forward to hearing from you. Thank you, Carolyn.
All right. Hello, everyone. Good morning and good evening. Depends on which area of the world you are in. I am Carolyn Dagani, President of Philippine Federation of the Deaf. I'm one of the prime movers of Filipino Sign Language, deaf rights, and other deaf-related movements in the Philippines. I'm also on advocating wherein many deaf people are empowered. And in my term as President of the Philippine Federation of the Deaf, membership has grown from 22 to 70 in less than 3 years. And then I'm also involved as chair of the Deaf Education Council, founding member of the Filipino Sign Language Advocacy Cooperative, and coordinator and administrator of the Visual Communication Assessment for the Deaf, a member of the Philippine Coalition on the UN Convention of the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, and coordinator of the National Deaf Network of FSL Access Team for COVID-19, to name a few. I have delivered lectures and presentations in various conferences, meetings, and assemblies from Luzon, Visayas, and Mindanao, and participated in national and international trainings and activities recently in Sri Lanka, Switzerland, Indonesia, Fiji, the United Kingdom, Thailand, and other countries. On women and gender-related advocacy, I'm also into cross-disability and CRPD issues or advocacies, serving as the official representative of the Philippine Alliance of Women with Disabilities for civil service organizations, was part of the delegation to the 64th session of CDAW for the review of the Philippines, presenting during public and private briefings in coordination with other Philippine community service organizations of indigenous women, migrant women workers, women living with HIV/AIDS, and rural women. Thank you.
Thank you, Carolyn. I might move then nextly to Barbra. Barbra Nyangairi, and apologies if I'm pronouncing names wrong, is the Executive Director of the Deaf Zimbabwe Trust. Barbra is she leads research and advocacy think tank on deaf and disability issues in Zimbabwe. And under her leadership, she has successfully advocated for policy reform and inclusion of persons with disabilities in electoral processes, increased access to information, sexual reproductive health rights, and psychosocial supports for parents and children with disabilities. So Barbara, over to you, and very welcome to have you here today in the panel.
Thank you very much. So I am the Executive Director of Deaf Zimbabwe Trust. Disability issues in Zimbabwe have been very topical since 1992, when we had our first Disabled Persons Act. Zimbabwe signed the convention in 2013, but since then we are still fighting for domestication of the CRPD. But we have had some progress in the work that we do as Deaf Zimbabwe Trust. We are providing psychosocial support for parents and children with disabilities, understanding that our disability discourse is still very much located in the witchcraft discourse. And as a result, there are negative attitudes, there are inequalities, barriers, and discrimination that are still very rife as a result of that. We are working to see access to justice. The ambassador very well described the vulnerabilities of women and girls with disabilities to sexual and gender-based violence. In our country, it's not different, because perpetrators may think that they can get away with it. So access to justice and creating a justice system that is more accessible and more able to really adjudicate issues in a free and fair way for women and girls with disabilities still remains a challenge, but we're making a lot of progress. We are popularizing sign language. In 2013, Zimbabwe promulgated a new constitution, and sign language became one of the official languages in our constitution. But the implementation of that, the operationalization of that, we have had to do strategic litigation where dialogue has not worked. I think we've had 2 cases where we had to do strategic litigation, take the issues to courts, where we had engaged and engagement was not working. We also are looking at issues of access to education. Women and girls with disabilities form, in terms of access to education, 90% of them have not been to school. This actually makes them more vulnerable to gender-based violence, because schools are actually protective spaces, and they are protected spaces, but the home, and as parents seek livelihoods outside the home, they're left by themselves vulnerable to all forms of abuse. So access to education is one of the things that we've been advocating, and we're excited that as Deaf Zimbabwe Trust, we contributed to an Education Amendment Act, which has disability provisions. So we are very excited about increased access to education. Our Education Act actually criminalizes not sending children to school, which was not there before. And we think that this will really work to increasing access to education for children with disabilities, and therefore limit vulnerability to violence. We also work towards training young persons with disabilities as advocates, self-advocates. And because of the lack of education, the ability to self-represent is very limited. And so that has to be changed. And so we're working towards all that. So we look forward to a very lively discussion as we discuss that. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you so much, Barbara. And we will be getting into more detail once we start the questions. So we'll be coming back to you. The last panelist and our third speaker is Tendai Dondofema. Tendai is a social worker with Deaf Zimbabwe Trust. You're very welcome, Tendai. And just I'll give a really brief introduction and you can come in then. Tendai is a trained ECD teacher. She's defied all the odds and become part of the first 4 deaf graduates in social work in Zimbabwe. And with support from family and Deaf Zimbabwe Trust, she's pursued her 3rd level education after her primary and her secondary education. So really wonderful to have you, Tendai, speaking from your experience today, and looking forward to hearing more. But over to you for the moment, maybe just to give us a little bit more insight into who you are. Thank you. I'm just going to check where the sign interpreter.
education for children with disabilities, training with sign language for women with disability inclusion. Thank you.
Okay, so that's a brief introduction. I think we missed the beginning of it because the sign interpretation didn't come on. Could we maybe just do
Sorry,
that again?
Mary, would you like her to start again?
Yeah, could you
She
just start?
seems
Yeah,
to have
yeah, that
lost
would be
network
great.
there.
Yeah, she may be having connection problems, but just in case she wants to reintroduce, absolutely, because I think we had. If she's having connection problems, we can also move on. So I'm just checking. It might be. It looks like the screen has frozen. So if I can maybe move on, and what we can do is once Tendai comes back online, we can come back to Tendai, if that's okay with everybody. These are the joys of moderating Zoom meetings when connections come in and out. So bear with us, everybody. So I might start then with the first question. And basically this is I'll go to Carolyn first with this. The theme of CSW this year is about the full and equal participation of women and the elimination of violence. What do you think are the biggest challenges for women and girls with disabilities in society in the Philippines?
Right. So generally, we have a lot of challenges for people with disabilities in general. In terms of accessibility, there have been a lot of barriers to accessibility, which then translates to how they access services to health, education, justice, social protection, among others. At the same time, they also have some troubles in terms of how the governance is here in the Philippines. You know, how the system of politics here in the Philippines. So this would have an effect on the national budgeting in terms of how this national and local implementation of laws and policies, and partnering with different civil society organizations and participation in government processes. Also, the geographic challenges here in the Philippines, because we have thousands of islands here, and there have been problems in terms of communication, movement, and varied situation of the local government, which some might have enough budget and some might not have. Some are poorer than the rest, and of course, the problem of disasters. The Philippines being very disaster-prone country, so many parts of the country are always hit by disasters. And of course, there's also the situation of armed conflict, like terrorism, especially in the southern part of the Philippines. And so, and of course, it's been exacerbated by the situation now because of COVID-19. So that really poses a lot of threats to the health and the economic balance of women with disabilities. Plus, of course, there's also, well, we're talking about women and girls with disabilities who are more at a disadvantage because they have fewer access to education. And of course, we're also dealing with the stereotypes, how society perceives them, taking on women and girls with disabilities, taking on more domestic chores, and that they are expected to be not assertive, but to be passive. So that's how society dictates the role of women. And of course, in terms of deaf women and girls here in the Philippines, we try to look at the number of cases, the reports that we have from 2006 to 2012, and we have about 346 cases that involves deaf women and girls all over the Philippines. And about 75 to 84% of these cases are filed by deaf women and girls. So, and this includes situations of rape and sexual violence, which is 10 times more likely to happen than other kinds of complaints. So these are mostly cases that involves gender-based violence. So those are, the current situation that we are facing now.
Great. Thank you so much, Carolyn. Before I go on, I just want to check if we're okay with Tendai to come back, just to see. Sorry, I can't see on my screen, so I'm just making sure. Is Tendai back in the room with us to maybe introduce herself again? And I can address that question also to Tendai. So welcome, Tendai, please go ahead.
My name is Tendai. My sign name is Tendai. I'm a social worker who works with persons with disability and support the children for support with education, training for people with disability, for inclusion in sign language, for children rights.
Great, Tendai. And maybe if I can ask you the same question I asked Carolyn. So the question is, in Zimbabwe, what do you think are the biggest challenges for women and girls with disabilities?
Because in Zimbabwe, GBV challenges are many in rural areas. We see more girls in rural areas don't attend school. Others refuse aid to go to education and are denied access to education by parents. Others are forced to get married fast. And the biggest problem is communication and access to services. There's a barrier in access to services. Others, if you want to go to report for rape, police don't understand communication and don't understand sign language. And again, others, husband abused while their wives, and they force them to sleep with them, and they don't give them money. Maybe because they are women with disabilities.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Tendai. Thank you. Can I just say, if there's any background noise with people with their microphones on, if they can mute, just sometimes it happens. And thank you very much, Tendai, for that answer. I'm going to come back again to Carolyn, if that's okay, Carolyn. So hi again. How are women with disabilities threatened with violence because they are active participants in society? Are women with disabilities intimidated for actively participating in society? So reflecting on your experience in the Philippines and all of your activism work, have you come across this experience? And maybe if you can share a little bit more, that would be great. Thank you.
So Mary, just want to clarify the question. If you won't mind repeating the question again, please.
Yes. So the question is, how are women with disabilities threatened with violence because they are active in their society? And that can be in any form of activism. And are women with disabilities intimidated for actively participating in society? So how have you seen women with disabilities being intimidated because they've become active, they've spoken out in their society on any particular topic? Is that clearer?
Right. Yes, thank you.
Great.
Well, a lot of times, well, let me talk about the impact first of this gender-based violence to women, because for many times there have been a lot of unresolved trauma for these women and girls with disability who experience GBV. Especially for the victims who are not able to access services to counseling or any form of assistance. And so this sometimes results to, loss of opportunity or interest in terms of education and employment, unwanted pregnancies, and in extreme cases, mental breakdowns, which would consequently lead to institutionalization in mental hospital or medical facilities. There's also repeated sexual violence that have led to several clusters of prostitution.
Thank you, Carolyn. And I think you raised the issue there about access to justice being a very key issue for women and girls with disabilities in terms of getting access to justice. So there's a question, our next question is related to that, and I might maybe start firstly with Barbra. So Barbra, how important is access to justice in the broader rights movement? And what are the challenges experienced for survivors with disabilities that you have found in through your work?
Thank you very much for that question. Access to justice is very, very important for women and girls with disabilities, particularly because of the risk of violence that they face on a daily basis. And as long as there is no access to justice, there is a sense of that you can abuse a person with a disability and get away with it. There are no penalties, there are no repercussions for that. And I think because of the lack of access to justice for women and girls in Zimbabwe, we have seen a lot of violence perpetrated on women and those with disabilities. And many of them the perpetrators have gotten away with it. And so strengthening the justice system is a very important mechanism for preventing gender-based violence. It is a very important way of making sure that perpetrators are brought to book and the right to justice is upheld. So one of the challenges, many challenges that we face in Zimbabwe with regards to the justice system is accessibility. And we are talking about physical access. The built environment is very much inaccessible. Until recently, most of our courts had steps and did not have facilities that would ensure physical access for women and girls with physical disabilities that would need accessible places such as ramps, lifts. Up until now, lifts are not available. The other challenge that we face is there is no preparation to receive women and girls with disabilities in our justice system. And this preparation could be just by way of disaggregation. So you're looking at from the police where the report is made up until a person gets to court. There is nothing that prepares the justice system to receive persons with disabilities. So one of the things that has happened many times we've been to court is that as you go to court, the prosecutors are surprised that the person are deaf. What do we do now? So you are looking at justice delayed, and many times justice denied. As cases are postponed because there's no preparedness to receive persons with disabilities, especially women and girls with disabilities who have been violated a lot more. You look at issues of communication barriers. So access is also not just the built environment, but communication barriers. We have had many cases that have been thrown out, particularly for women and girls who are deaf, as well as women and girls with intellectual disabilities, because of the communication barriers and the way in which our justice system does not have the mechanisms to provide communication support for women and girls with disabilities. The other issue is awareness, the lack of awareness, the reporting mechanism, how to report, where to report, when to report, and what to do. As Zimbabwe, we have done a lot of initiatives for preventing gender-based violence. We've got a number of organizations that work on access to justice and the prevention of violence. Unfortunately, in their awareness programs, many of them have not been able to include women and those with disabilities. The information has not been provided in accessible formats. At times, the environment where these awareness campaigns are conducted, maybe they are radio programs, but deaf women can't access them, deaf girls can't access radio programs. The lack of simplification of processes and procedures. one of the things that we've also seen is that the justice system itself can be very intimidating. It is not a space that you just get into and you understand what's going on. And that has been a deterrent to actually reporting cases. Tendai spoke about failing to report rape when it occurs. That is a very common issue here. And so you find that perpetrators are not brought to book, and therefore they think they can do it again and again, and they can go on and perpetrate violence against a number of women and girls with disabilities. The legal framework, our legal framework is also not very inclusive in that it doesn't exactly provide specific provisions for how to provide support to access justice for women and girls with disabilities.
Barbara, thank you so much for taking us through, because it's such a systemic issue. It's from, you know, it's from the highest levels in terms of getting access to court to the very basic levels of being able to get access to very important services. I want to ask that same question to Tendai, so I can just ask it again. And then once I finish it, I will go to a question from the audience. So Tendai, you've heard Barbara speak in terms of the issues in terms of accessing justice. And I think maybe just to hear a bit from you, from your perspective, about how important is access to justice in the broader rights movement, and what are the challenges experienced for survivors with disabilities? So Tendai, over to you if you're comfortable to answer that, and then I will move to a question from the audience.
In courts, police have problems with sign language. They don't understand sign language, because children, if they are raped, if they want to go to report, it's very difficult for them. Ask the police later, you come back later, ask to report their interpreters, they are very difficult, and to report their cases is very different. The abuse continues and the perpetrators are not brought to book. And for children with disability, they decrease, and the challenges. The person who have raped them go free, and they don't even get their justice. In Zimbabwe, sign language, there's no sign language in Zimbabwean courts. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tendai. And I know that Carolyn probably has a lot to add into this as well, because it's been a lot of Carolyn's work. But I might just come to a question from one of our Irish colleagues, actually. So can I clarify with Carolyn, Barbara and Tendai, if the organizations you're with represent or work with all disabled women with different impairments? So maybe just to hear a little bit more. I think Carolyn, you spoke about all of your work with as a disabled woman in the disabled movement in the Philippines, and also Barbara and Tendai from the Zimbabwe perspective. Is that question clear to everybody?
Yes.
Okay, so who'd like to go first? Yeah, go ahead,
Master.
Carolyn.
All right. I am involved in the different movements in the sector. Yeah, advocacies in education, also on coalition, the CRPD. I'm also part of that with other disability rights movement advocates. So also on women and on gender, also on sexual reproductive health rights. So yes, I work with disabilities.
Yes. And you're coming from the representative perspective, Carolyn. You're speaking on behalf of persons with disabilities for persons with disabilities. Yeah. Barbara, I might come to you, Barbara, and Tendai on that just quickly. Yeah.
Yes, in Zimbabwe, yes, at this Zimbabwe Trust, we help different deaf women in different communities to fight abuse and solve their problems. We continue to help them. Either they don't know sign language and they're abused and they don't know what to do, or we don't work. Other who work with wheelchairs, they don't have ramps, hearing aids, and they don't even know what sign claims for those who have albino. As if this Zimbabwe Trust, we work with everyone who have different disabilities, and we continue to support them. Women at home have problems, they call us, and we solve their problem. And if their problem is not solved, we solve them as we hope to solve them as Deaf Zimbabwe Trust. Thank you.
Thank you. Anything else to add there from? Okay. Yeah, do you have something to add in, Tendai or Barbara? That's, yeah, okay. So maybe I might just move on, and that's that's a very important question around, because it's always a key issue when we're working from a disability rights perspective around how we are cross impairment, across all groups of persons with disabilities, but also recognizing that certain groups of persons with disabilities can also be very much left behind in conversations, whether it's about access to justice or in general in terms of gender equality. So I'm going to come, Carolyn, back to you, if that's okay. I know that you've worked quite a bit with Indigenous women and Muslim women in the Philippines. Can you talk about the importance of an intersectional approach or your experience that you've had raising this issue at CEDAW? And I'm very aware of the work that you've done with the CEDAW committee, Carolyn. It's been very groundbreaking to bring disabled women's rights into general women's rights. So I think maybe to hear a little bit about that experience would be really good. Thank you, Carolyn.
All right. It's truly important. For example, Muslim women or IP or indigenous people, these are intersectionalities that have to be recognized and identified to empower women. Some are even forced into marriage, as you know. They don't know, Muslim women don't know their rights, especially the laws in the Philippines. They are not empowered because they are not educated. Many are not educated. We've had discussions on accessibility to education, meetings, but it's always, they have been barriers, always and always. Sometimes even their own families take advantage of them because they are not aware of their rights, gender rights. Those coming from Mindanao or the Bangsamoro Alternative Region in Mindanao. It's a province down south of the Philippines. I've met with young women, deaf women. Some lost their hearing eventually, and issues of politics have been, not politics, religion even, are barriers for them to have access. I think I even attended or participated in international conference of Muslim people, of deaf Muslims, and it was the first time that I was there. They had their own vocabulary. It's different. They had their own science, way too different from the Catholic science that we have, and also we have connections with ASEAN organizations where they have interpreters for their own mosques. So their culture down south is very rich. And what happened to me in CEDAW, that was in 2016, I spoke and represented the Philippine delegation, and I talked about the case of R. And this was a very sensitive issue because the CEDAW committee, or the Operation Protocol, in 2011, which was filed in 2011, but eventually sent to the government in 2013, but has not received any reply from the government since this case of R. And I raised this point where this deaf person was raped with no interpreters during that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Carolyn. And I know that one of the challenges always around how we bring disabled women's rights into the perspective of the wider women's rights issues. And I think that's something that's growing, and all of the work that all of our panelists do really contribute to that. So I might just come to another question from one of our participants, and the question is to Barbara. Barbara, have there been any deliberate attempt to engage security agencies, especially the police, on the issues of GBV and providing knowledge and capacity building for responding to cases? So I think this is back to your previous discussion a few moments ago around the challenges at a systemic level with regard to inclusion. So maybe if you could address that, that would be great. And thank you to the participant for the great question.
Thank you very much, Mary. That's a very important question. We have been engaging, not just us, but a number of organizations have been working with the police to ensure increased access to justice. And we're very excited that the police has been very receptive to our efforts. They have officers who have learned sign language. The victim-friendly unit has come up with measures to ensure inclusive processes in terms of receiving cases. There's still more that can be done. Like I said, how do we prepare the justice system from the police, the time the report is made, up to the issue when it's in court? So that whole ecosystem needs to be prepared to be able to handle cases. Yes, there is a lot of work being done. The police are very receptive, and we look forward to working more with them. I think inclusion, Mary, you have experienced, is very incremental. It's a little step and a little step and a little step. So we've been taking progressive steps to make it possible. And it's been a very good journey so far. Unfortunately, it's been delayed because for a long time, nothing has been done. Women with disabilities have been raped. Children have been born out of those rape cases, and nothing has been done to the perpetrators. They've gone free. So we hope that it's the beginning of the end of a generation where women and girls with disabilities are just abused and no one is brought to book.
Thank you, Barbara. Anybody else on the panel like to come in on that before I move on to the next question? Carolyn or Tendai, if you have anything to add to that. There's no pressure to come in all the time, so don't worry about that if there's nothing to add for the moment. Carolyn.
All right. I think it's also important to note that deaf, not just the deaf, but also other people with disabilities are advocates themselves. They have to be included in sensitivity trainings, and be aware of the UNCRPD as well. So they are aware of their rights. They have to work together. We all people with disabilities have to work together, work as one, have our numbers increase, be inspiration. So we take down all these barriers and we get our access and participate fully eventually.
Thank you. Thank you, Carolyn. Thank you very much for that intervention. I'm keeping an eye on the questions in the chat room, and thank you to my behind the scenes people who are helping with this as well. I've maybe 2 or 3 more questions just to ask the panelists that I have prepared. So if there are other questions coming, please do send them now. So I might just come to Barbara and Tendai with this question. And this is more from a kind of an INGO perspective. So, you know, CBM Global is an INGO. Organizations here are INGOs. We're not representative organizations. So, but from a program perspective, I think many INGO organizations feel intimidated by disability inclusion, thinking that inclusion is a really specialized and difficult thing. What is your experience with this? And what suggestions do you have for INGOs? So what suggestions do you have for INGOs to become more disability inclusive? So Barbara and Tendai.
Tendai will take it first and I will add on.
Great.
So inclusion is an attitude, is start at program design, and it is reflected in the financial and material resources allocated. It is very difficult caused by ignorance and attitudes and fear. The same investment that was made for gender inclusion must be made for disability inclusion. Training is an intentional. Resources should be allocated to disability inclusion. For women with disability, they must be included. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tendai. And Barbara, I think you have something to add to that.
Just that many a times international organizations have put in disability inclusion as an afterthought. And as Tendai said, there are no resources to support inclusion. And so when you then say, oh, persons with disabilities are welcome, let's come in. But the program design has not been inclusive. So if it's an afterthought, it means you don't have resources for sign language interpreters, you don't have resources for simplified materials, you've not budgeted for inclusion. And therefore it becomes very difficult to include persons with disabilities in our work. So inclusion for IGOs has been an afterthought. And I think that I appreciate the work that CBM has been doing to go to the partners and funders to say disability is something that you actually budget for, as you are giving resources to different partners. Bring in disability at that point in your project programs design, in your initial allocation of resources, so that it's not an afterthought. So I think that's just what has been our experience. And I've seen CBM train GIZ globally to begin to include in their program design inclusion, disability management training for different international organizations has been going on, which is very, very important so that inclusion is not an afterthought. In Zimbabwe, we've got a number of international organizations that are really embracing inclusion in its entirety, and we're seeing lots of progress in terms of work with persons with disabilities in different spaces, be it education, employment, informal, the informal economy, uplift financial inclusion. There's a real buzz for inclusion in our country that is being led by international organizations, but it just didn't happen. It was as a result of intentional work by CBM Global to begin to bring the inclusion agenda on the table for every sector that we're working in. Whatever sector has to be inclusive, and we've seen that happening. So we're very happy for the progress that is being done. Thank you.
Thank you, Barbara. And just maybe to come back really briefly on that point, because I think a lot of INGOs can have the resources to do that, but it's really about the movements and who we partner with, and partnering with disabled people's organizations are really, really key for this in terms of inclusion. We can't have inclusion without having disabled people's organizations and women-led disabled women's organizations involved in inclusion. So I have some kind of just broad, I'm conscious of the time, we have estimated 90 minutes, but also we don't always have to go to 90 minutes, and some questions are coming in. So we'll keep going a few for the next little while. So these are more just at a policy level. We had the ambassador with us earlier, which is really wonderful. Ireland is sitting and has its seat on the Security Council at the moment, which is really, from us in Ireland, this is really important for us. But it's also a really great opportunity to look at how to make sure people are not left behind. And I think that's a challenge. So to all of the panelists, I'm putting this question: do you have any messages that you'd like to pass on to the Irish government as they're sitting on the UN Security Council for ensuring that disability is adequately addressed? So what would be your key message that you would like to send? And it go to whoever wants to speak first.
I think I can start.
Yeah.
Thank you. I think for Zimbabwe, our message would be that to make disability inclusion a priority on the Security Council. It is a global problem. It is not just an African or continental problem. It is a global problem. Other countries have made progress with regards to inclusion, but there's still challenges. But Africa is still lagging behind in terms of making inclusion a priority in most of our interventions. And so we are looking at, there's a time when disability, there was a decade of inclusion, a decade that was dedicated to disability inclusion. And I'm thinking that it's important that we actually put and prioritize disability, as in giving it priority and eminence in all our work by making it core in everything that is being done by the Security Council. The CRPD has been ratified by a lot of countries. It is the domestication, it is the implementation of those progressive provisions in the CRPD that lags behind. So we don't want tokenism. How do we move away from just token ratification so that we look good, so that countries look good, and then they don't do anything about it? And I think that's our message that Ireland has to bring to the Security Council, that we do not want tokenism. It has to be genuine inclusion of persons with disabilities across all sectors.
Thanks,
Thank
Barbara. Does Tendai want to come in, or will I move to Caroline? I'm just checking. So maybe we'll move to Carolyn. If you've got a key, have you got any key message you'd like to give as Ireland has its seat on the Security Council? What would you like to see the focus?
Right, Mary, thank you for that. Well, again, we thank you for that opportunity to get involved, but I'd just like to emphasize on for all women and girls with disabilities, that in all levels of decision making that would affect their rights, we need to empower them. We need to allow them to decide for themselves. We need to make sure that their rights are recognized. Always have the basis, the legal framework of the CRPD for full inclusion. We don't, actually adhere to the charity perspective anymore, but more on the rights perspective. So we need to recognize that in all levels of decision making, we need to involve women and girls with disabilities. So I think that's the key message that I would like to emphasize. The saying that nothing about us without us. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Carolyn. That's a very important and very key message. I just check anybody else wants to come in before I just, because there's a related question. So Carolyn, you spoke there about women with disabilities needing to be in the room around decision making and being there and included. So I'd really, if you could share a little bit about what your experience is linking with grassroots disability women activists with international forums, because I think a lot of the time what we have is very big international discussions around gender equality and disability inclusion, but actually linking it to grassroots and making sure that the grassroots voices are included is really critical. So hearing maybe just a little bit more from you on that, and then Barbara and Tendai, if either of you wanted to come in on that also, that would be great. So is that okay, Carolyn?
If
okay,
I can,
yeah, go first. Yeah.
Thank
Want
you.
me to repeat? Or are we okay?
So I think that in terms of grassroots promotion, we're looking at the issue about education. I think Carolyn Tendai brought to the fore the challenges with access to education and how that denies many women and girls with disabilities a chance to sit on the table to make decisions, because they're not even in the spaces when the decisions are made. There is also elitism, unfortunately, that even within the disability sector itself, there is elitism that is preventing women and girls with disabilities at the grassroots level to come in and be part of this big movement. Poverty. Zimbabwe, for example, is a very informalized economy. And how do you participate when you are running after the daily livelihood, putting bread on your table? So the ability to then participate in the women's movement becomes very peripheral, because you are looking at these issues that are pressing, the urgent issues of putting food on the table. So those are some of the challenges that have resulted in the sidelining of women and girls with disabilities to participate even in the women's movement. Here in our country, the women's movement itself is a challenging space for women and girls with disabilities, because the meetings are not accessible, the information is not provided in accessible formats, and that goes back to the design of the programs by the women's movement and how that can then ensure that inclusion takes place. So participation in the grassroots processes for women in the grassroots, we need to start, as Zimbabwe Trust, we have thought that education is priority, because education puts you in spaces that you would not be if you're not educated. So which is why our main focus as an organization is ensuring that women and girls with disabilities have access to education, because this will ensure that they are able to participate in decision-making processes, you know, from a very informed point of view. So education is very, very key. Thank you.
Great. Carolyn, I see you had your hand up there. Was it to come in?
Right. Well, if I may add to what Barbara mentioned, here in the Philippines, while we have seen some improvements, but still we are considered a poor country. So we had limited resources and accessibility to services, you know, to education, to employment, health services, social protection. And so we had a lot of barriers, you know, even comparing it to the poor, the general public. Like, for example, a concrete example would be during this COVID pandemic, where there was a social amelioration program by the government, and millions of pesos have been allocated to the Ministry of Social Welfare and Development, to local governments. However, these deaf people could not even get basic information about, you know, where to access these funds, where to get support. And so, you know, we're talking about different levels, different layers of barriers, systemic barriers. And so the non-inclusive governance is something that, you know, from as basic as the use of language, which marginalizes deaf people even further. And so what happens now, we talk about, you know, Filipino Sign Language being a means to have that accessibility. And we have been lobbying and advocating for the recognition of that for the longest time. And, you know, how we use that particular legislation in order to break down those barriers to communication, you know, the Philippines being disaster-prone country. However, we need to have the government take more accountability in terms of addressing these inclusion concerns that we have, especially at the local level. So we also need to make sure in terms of data gathering, we need to have more disaggregated data, which is very crucial, especially at the local level. We have a lot of areas, regions in the Philippines that are not reached by these programs, by these social protection programs. And so we have to make sure that these are being addressed as well. Thank you.
Great. And Carolyn, really important point. And I think it actually links in to, oh, sorry, yeah. Tendai, please, sorry, apologies.
Digital poverty, lack of internet, lack of ICT gadgets is a problem. For example, computers, phones, laptops, very difficult. For example, Skype, how do you use it if you don't have, for people with disabilities, it's very difficult. Sign language, you don't have sign language and you don't hear voice. in Zimbabwe, people with disabilities have challenges on that. During this COVID-19 time, because COVID-19 on the level is very difficult to read your information. On radio they have information, but it's very difficult to communicate. How do you communicate with phones if you have digital poverty?
Great, thank you, Barbara. And I think just to come back to some of your comments there and to maybe connect with one of the comments in the room, in the chat room. And I think back to Barbara, what you said, and also Carolyn around, the non-inclusion pieces. We need to include reasonable accommodation in project design. We need to think of when we're doing all of these big programs, and whether they're at a national level in terms of a COVID rollout vaccination program or information program, or whether it's at a project level, that inclusion, reasonable accommodation, and thinking about inclusion is really critical. So I think thank you to the colleague who raised that in the chat room, because I think that's a key theme that's coming across as each speaker speaks. So I'm going to look at, I have two more questions, and then in terms of anybody else, we can look at that. So we're moving towards the SDGs. I mean, we're looking at 2030, being its kind of the framework for its finalizing, and there's a huge amount of effort and emphasis on accelerating the SDGs and the Sustainable Development Goals for people who don't know who the SDGs are. And the Sustainable Development Goals have put a really big emphasis on leaving no one behind. So I'd ask the panelists maybe to give kind of your quick thoughts on, do you think we're on track to achieving the goals that the SDGs is looking for in terms of gender equality and wider goals in terms of education? Okay, so we go to Carolyn first, because I see your hand up first. So go ahead.
Right. Well, if we're talking about the Philippines in general, unfortunately, no, we are still not on track. Filipinos with disabilities, most especially, are still being left behind, and that includes deaf people. There have been very poor efforts from the National Council on Disability Affairs to implement the National Plan of Action, the Incheon strategy to promote these SDGs. And there have been very little, if not, data disaggregation on how SDGs impact the Sustainable Development Goals, impact persons with disabilities, and the deaf community in general. We're talking about the goal number 10 on reduce inequality, and goal number 16 on peace, justice, and strong institutions. And these two Sustainable Development Goals have not seen any improvement at all since 2000 for deaf women and girls. And I mentioned about the case of R, so that's one concrete example of that.
Great, Carolyn. So more to be done, I think, is coming from you, the key message. Yeah, Barbara, we might come to you next then. And Barbara and Tendai, please come in terms of your thoughts on this.
Thank you very much. I think the SDGs are a very important tool for equalizing and increasing access to development for countries. Unfortunately, for Zimbabwe, the knowledge about SDGs among the disability community is very, very limited. We did a survey as Deaf Zimbabwe Trust, I think in 2020, on the knowledge of SDGs. They do not know them. So how do you aim for a target that is not known by the people that are supposed to benefit from, these SDGs? So I think one of the things that has to happen is to move them from the elite spaces where they are to the grassroots spaces in terms of awareness, because they are a very important tool that persons with disabilities can use to hold governments accountable to them, because they are signatory to those SDGs. And 2030 is not very far, but I would say that as we are right now, we are still very far from achieving them. especially the ones that Carolyn alluded to, issues of reducing inequality, as long as children with disabilities, 90% of children with disabilities in Zimbabwe do not access education. How do you work to reduce inequality when the basic things such as education are not accessible for children and persons with disabilities? When we talk of higher education in Zimbabwe, for example, less than 1% of persons with disabilities have access to higher and tertiary education. How do you reduce inequality when you have such very low numbers of inclusion? Tendai is one of the first 4 social workers who are deaf in our country since independence, which is 40 years ago. And we have 4 social workers who are deaf. How do you reduce inequality with those levels? So I think we're very far, and I'd agree with Carolyn, we have a lot of work to do. And I think the political will is not there. There is an excitement to sign these treaties, and yet when we come to the grind of actually working and making sure that they're a reality, we don't see that happening.
Thank you, Barbara. Before I come to Tendai, if Tendai wants to add in, I just want to come back to Carolyn for a moment, because Carolyn, you've been through the Bridge program, which is the program with the International Disability Alliance and the International Disability and Development Consortium, which is training capacity building persons with disabilities around the connection between the Sustainable Development Goals and the CRPD, the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. Can you maybe share really quickly how critical that has been for you, and how you've used going through that program for your activism and advocacy?
Right, I am very grateful to IDA, International Disability Alliance, for that opportunity to be included in the Bridge training program. So they have really extensively explained to us the connection between the SDG and CRPD, and look at their common points and see how this could be used as the framework. For example, talking about access to justice, and which article that would respond to in CRPD, and which goal in SDG we could actually use that. So I think this legal frameworks, this the learnings that I had in Bridge training is really crucial, especially when we're doing advocacy work. I think this is very important that knowledge, awareness about these policies, about these frameworks, in terms of how we could encourage, how we could convince the government to take action in the things that we are fighting for. I think these are really strong legal basis for our advocacy work.
Okay. Thank you, Carolyn. It struck me it was important to raise that, because I know it's a program that's been done with many grassroots activists of persons with disabilities. I'm just going to come back if Tendai had anything to add in there before I ask the last question. And if not, I'm just keeping an eye out on the... Okay, because I also don't want to put pressure on people to be answering questions when they don't need to be. So yeah, perfect. So I'm going to come to maybe the last question, because we're kind of, unless there's anything other burning questions in the chat room on this. So I mean, we wrapping up this really detailed conversation, which has gone from like the systemic issues that we need to challenge and look at in terms of inclusion, and the whole concept of how inclusion is done in a nothing about us without us, as the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disability obligates governments to do. It's not voluntary, it's obligatory. So, and I think there's so much around kind of access to justice, access as Barbara spoke about, education being really key. So it's very multifaceted. Sometimes we can feel like it's a bit too much to do, but I think we have a lot of activists and a lot of people who are able to come to the table to support on inclusion, and it's not having to be only ever one person's role, it's everybody's role in society to do this. So just on a kind of a closing message to each of our panelists, what message or vision would you like people from this webinar to leave with in terms of all of what we've discussed? So whoever would like to go first with that would be great. Whoever, put your hand up. Yeah, Carolyn, there's a hand, go ahead.
All right, I believe it's truly important that to have more trainings on empowerment and to take note of the importance of intersectionalities, that this just doesn't occur at one level. And yes, to empower deaf women and all women with disabilities as well. For us in the Philippines, yes, that's our goal. We are pushing everyone that the IRR be enacted, or the implementing rules and regulations of the law, the Filipino Sign Language law that we have already, because this is our legacy to the future deaf, or future Filipino deaf. And that we should engage with each other, form bonds, partnerships, interact with each other, and make sure that you're included always. Thank you.
Thank you. Very important messages, Carolyn. Barbara and Tendai, have you anything you'd like to add as your final messages before I go back to Siobhan for some closing remarks as well?
My message is inclusion is an attitude to fight against gender-based violence for women and girls who have disabilities. We have to work together as communities, families, governments, and international communities. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Barbara.
I think for us in Zimbabwe, I would say that I think even globally, but also continentally, sexual and gender-based violence is the hidden pandemic among women and girls with disabilities. It is a very serious threat to their enjoyment of their rights, to their achievement of their full potential, and we need to take it very seriously. I would like to say that it takes the political, the economic, and the will by all of us to fight gender-based violence against women and girls with disabilities, so that they are able to fulfill their potential and live a life that is enjoyable and happy for them. Thank you.
Great, and that's a really important message to finish on. I mean, I think I want to say thank you so much to our fantastic panelists who have really shared a breadth of knowledge and their experience today. And I think a key thing is that it's also people coming with representative views, coming from the movement and having voices heard. Siobhan, I see your camera's back on, so I'm going to say a quick thank you to everybody, all of the sign interpreters also, and behind the scenes people, because you make it a lot easier. Doing these webinars, I think they're much easier face-to-face sometimes, even though Zoom is incredibly inclusive in some ways to have us all together when we can't be. Siobhan, please, over to you. I think you'd wanted to come in quickly. Yeah.
Yes, thank you. Of course, appreciate all the sign expertise that was in the room, and particularly, as you have said, Mary, to Tendai and to Barbara and Carolyn for, heartfelt thanks for taking the time to be with us and to share your insights with us. And I can see that the exchanges are going to follow and connections are being made. And I liked one of the most recent things that was said. There was a lot I liked. Inclusion is an attitude. I thought that was quite a powerful statement. I want to just thank Mary for being convening us and bringing the conversation forward so constructively, and also to the ambassador in her absence and her colleagues for joining us. So the consortium was really pleased to partner with the Department of Foreign Affairs on this event. And of course, thanks to the staff of the consortium as well, Brianna and Abby, for putting everything and bringing us all together. So thank you. And I think let's stay in touch and take the conversations and our work together forward.
Yeah.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everybody. And there will be a recording of this webinar made available. And a really big thanks to Abby and Brianna behind the scenes who pulled all of this together, just turned up on the day to help moderate, but there's been a huge amount of work behind the scenes on this. So very much thank you to that. And thank you to everybody for coming. Take care and stay safe, everybody.